In this tutorial, we're going to be painting a bright, bold, brilliant sunflower. And what I'm doing here first is I'm just going to be sketching it out. And the way that I simplify flowers and organic shapes when I'm drawing freehand is I try to just find the most basic geometric shapes. So in this case, there's two concentric circles, one larger and a little bit oblong. And then the circle or oval in the center represents the center of the flower. And this just helps me get a sense of the anchor point for the petals and then the outer limit for the petals as well. So we get a nice organic shape that also is a little bit geometric, at least as far as nature kind of determines that. And so as I look at my photo reference, I'm just trying to get a general sense of the shape of these petals. I'm not really overly concerned with an exact replication of my photo reference. And actually, I made a couple of changes from the photo reference. As you'll see, the center of my sunflower is much, much smaller than the center of the photo reference. And I did that on purpose. I just wanted to have my petals be a lot more prominent than that dark center. And then once I have this sketch finished up and I've kind of defined it, I'm going to transfer that over onto my watercolor paper. So I'm putting my sketch on top of the watercolor paper using some masking tape just to keep everything in place. And then I'm putting my carbon paper face down, facing my watercolor paper. And I'm going to use a pretty light touch, and I'm just going to check to see how dark my lines are transferring, because since these petals are going to be yellow, they're going to be pretty light. I don't really mind if my pencil marks show through a little bit, but I definitely don't want to go overboard with really dark marks. And then I'm always going to check my watercolor paper to make sure I didn't miss any spots before I remove the template. And that way I don't have to worry about realigning it if I did miss a big spot. All right, so I've got that all transferred, and now I'm going to use my tape to fix my watercolor paper onto my board. And this just helps to create a nice white border around the painting, which is just a look that I like, but it also helps with buckling. And since we're going to be using a lot of wet techniques for this painting, we will see some buckling. All right, so I've got my paints ready, and I'm just using my mop brush to wet this entire surface. I'm not too worried about the edges and the corners right now, but I want a really nice soft wash applied initially. And I'm just using my lemon yellow right now to define where the petals are really bright and they're being illuminated. And I don't mind if that kind of bleeds outside of the lines right now, and in fact I kind of did that on purpose. If I didn't want that to happen, I could just apply that clear water to the areas that I want bleeding. But in this case, I don't mind keeping everything really nice and soft at the beginning phase. And then I'm using my warmer yellow to indicate where some of those petals are receiving a little bit less light, or they're more overlapped. They're not as transparent. And then toward the center of the flower, I'm noticing that it's even just a little bit more orange. So I put that there and just kind of let it bleed in. Now you can see I'm being a little bit more careful around my petals because I want to maintain that nice bright yellow in the petals that are getting a lot of light. And so I needed to make sure that that area was dry enough for me to apply paint and not have the orange bleed onto my nice yellow petals. And now I'm just using my ultramarine blue, which is my cool blue, to start putting the background in. The background is going to be a lot of blues and greens, of course. And also with this background, I'm going to build it up quite a bit, and with watercolor you always start with your lighter values, and where you want to have darker values you're going to have to build that up incrementally. But you can take that to whatever limit you want. I'm going to take my background fairly dark just because I really want my bright petals to stand out and look like the sun is shining right through them, and so I want that contrast. But to be honest, watercolor sometimes looks really good when it's just very light and pastel. Even the way that I have it right now I think could be almost a complete background because it's very abstract and loose. There's a lot of color variation that keeps it interesting. So that's really up to you. And in this composition, I probably have more background than I'd really prefer. I almost wish that I had oriented this to be a vertical composition because then there wouldn't be so much background to take care of. So that's one thing to consider. And so I actually, for the template for this course, I actually have a horizontal template and I have a vertical template. In the vertical template, you wouldn't have to worry so much about all this background because I think that I spend almost my majority of time on the background. And so basically what I'm doing is I am just kind of continuously building up the colors in the background, creating a little bit more depth by using a lot of blue, adding, some green, but then also some variation. I do have a distant flower back there that I think adds a nice variation to the background, but I also don't want it to be competing with the focal point of my painting, which of course is the large sunflower. So I'll need to be careful to kind of push that into the background so it's not diverting away from the primary subject. And you can see that I am kind of just going back and forth, alternating between adding more blue, adding more yellow to the mix, just so I get lots of variety of greens. And I'm not being careful at all about the background except where I'm putting paint right next to my flower petals. All right, now I've let my whole background dry quite a bit and I'm switching over to my larger brush. It doesn't hold as much water, but it covers more surface. And I'm going to use that to apply a nice blue transparent glaze over most of the background. And blue is kind of a nice contrast to the yellow and orange that will be in the subject of the painting. And it also just kind of creates a sense of distance in the background, so it kind of pushes everything back a little bit more. And I'm even mixing up just a little bit of kind of a purplish color because that's also a nice contrast to all the yellow that I'll have in the subject. But I'm being very subtle with it. I don't really want to have a background that looks purple, but I do just want a little bit of that variation and contrast. And so with the background, you can really have fun and just experiment and not worry too much. And if, like me, you end up with a composition where you maybe have a little bit more background than you would like, that's actually not a problem because you could always crop your painting down. And now I'm cleaning off my palette because I'm getting ready to work on the petals and I want a nice clean mixing surface so that my yellows don't get polluted with other colors. And I've switched over to my larger round brush. I'm still working very loose. These petals, of course, are dry at this point, and so I'm kind of just using this yellow as a glaze. I want to maintain some of those lighter values that I have in there. But there's some areas that do just need to have a little bit more color and saturation. And when I say glaze, glaze refers to a method of applying transparent paint on top of a dry surface so that the surface underneath still shows through and you get a little bit of optical blending, which makes for some really interesting color combinations. Now I'm using my warmer yellow to go in and define where some of the petals are overlapping, or they're foreshortened, or they're just not receiving so much light and they're not quite as transparent as the really bright yellow portions of the petals. And now I'm using a lot of red into this mixture, and I'm just starting to define the base of the petals, where the petals kind of meet the center of the flower. Because if you look at the photo reference, you can definitely see that the petals, where they connect to the center of the flower, they are a little bit less transparent. They're a lot warmer in temperature. And that kind of just helps to define the flower. And I don't usually have a brown color on my palette, and so what I usually do is I try to just mix my colors to replicate complicated colors like that. And basically all I mixed here was a violet, so it's just red and blue. But then when I apply that as a glaze over that yellow center, it's going to build up to create the look of being brown. And to me, that's one of the funnest things about doing any kind of painting, is just trying to figure out how I can use the really basic colors that I have, usually just the primaries, and create really natural looking colors. And now I'm mixing up a nice warm color, and I'm going to use this to help me further define some of the striations that I can see in the petals. And as I get closer to working on more of the details like this, you can see that I'm not working quite so loosely anymore. I'm giving a lot more thought to where I apply the paint because I don't want to overdo it with details. I want my flower to remain nice and soft and painterly, and yet I do want to have enough definition in here so it doesn't, look like, just a big blob of yellow. But I'm just being very careful with where I apply these darker colors. And also, when you apply these darker colors at the base of the petals and where they overlap, that really adds to the contrast, and it adds to that sense of those petals that are receiving a lot of light being very translucent or transparent. And there's definitely a happy medium with details, especially when it comes to flowers, because I want my petals to continue looking really soft and delicate, but I also want a little bit of detail in there. And so the key is just not to overdo it and to step back every once in a while and take a look and see, if you step back and you look at your painting and you can see that something is missing, then I'd say it is safe to maybe experiment with adding a little bit more detail. But if you step back from your painting and you're like, I can see what's going on, I can see, that there's some definition between the petals, but everything's still looking nice and light and delicate, maybe that's a good indicator to stop adding details at that point. And now you see that I'm mixing up a really dark color. And the key between applying a color that's going to be really dark or one that's going to be really light is actually just the amount of water that you put in your mix. So this mix has a lot more pigment to water, whereas a really light color would have more water compared to how much pigment is in there. And sometimes it's helpful to have a piece of scrap paper right next to you so that you can make a mark there before you place it on your painting, and that helps you just develop a sense for determining how much water or how much pigment you need to get a certain effect. So I'm really close to being finished with this painting right now. And I know that determining when to stop is a challenge still for me. And right now I'm just kind of fiddling with the background, adding a little bit of definition, but also kind of softening things up back there a little bit. And right now I'm actually just using a little bit of my nice bright red that's kind of a magenta red, just to add a little bit of accent to the center of the flower. Definitely being careful not to go overboard with this, but I'm just wanting to add a little bit of interest in there because it's very orange. And I think that, you know, the deeper crevices are actually nice and bright and bold. And then I just cleaned up my palette. And I'm very carefully removing the tape by pulling it outward away from the painting. And that's basically it for this nice little sunflower painting.